let me say a few words about Lucie Cluver. She's a Lucie Cluver, how do I pronounce it?
Spot on.
Perfect. Her lecture's entitled, Can Social Science Protect Us Against Global Threats? You read her CV, and I had a glance at the slides before the lecture, sneak glance. Don't worry, I haven't seen all of it. She's quite a woman. Professor of Child and Family Social Work in the Centre for Evidence-Based Social Intervention at Oxford, and a governing fellow of Nuffield College, of which I've an association actually. She's an internationally recognised leader in research on families and children in Africa, and she works collaboratively with African and other colleagues, local, national and global institutions. As PI and co-PI, she's raised, wait for this, over £50 million in research grants, and is author and co-author of over 250 articles in peer-reviewed journals. Actually, she tells me that the recent cuts in the overseas aid budget have actually reduced some of that grant. So we're with you. Solidarity. Her research focuses on the most vulnerable of young people, and the themes are COVID-19, HIV, and the orphanhoods that have resulted, parenting programs to prevent violence against children, and adolescent girls in HIV. Her team and Lucie and her team, they're renowned for their impact beyond actually the university world, the academy, on government policies, international collaborations and successful interventions. And she's been widely recognised. She's won the 2021 and 2017, the AIDS Children 2022, and the EU's Horizon 2020 Impact Award. So she'll be talking about 45 minutes. We'll take a few questions and answers. But welcome, Lucie. Fantastic to have you.
Well, thank you. And thank you especially to Rita and Sarah, who've been so helpful. And for Rita for telling me that my original proposal was a little too hubristic. Everything that I'm going to talk about today, I blame on a rabble-rousing and incendiary book that I read at the impressionable age of 16.
Oh, God.
This is the actual copy. The first is that the world does not have to be as it is. And you can work within them to change them. And so, as we think about what Professor Sir Jeff Mulgan talked about in last year's annual lecture, the crises that are facing us, these polycrises, as Adam Tooze calls them, of climate change, of conflict and the loss of democracy, of new pandemics that the WHO predicts will be coming in the next decade. As we think about these, I'd like to share some lessons I've learned, some thoughts, some mistakes, as we think about what the potential could be of social science to mitigate, to address them. And I'll start 10 years after reading that rabble-rousing book. I was working as a social worker in this township in Khayelitsha, just over the hill, you see, in a shipping container that got to 40 degrees on a bad day. And I was working as a social worker and doing my PhD, in which we'd interviewed 1,000 children, half of whom were orphaned by HIV/AIDS. It was the height of the epidemic in South Africa, and every time I walked into a home, there was someone dying in a bed in the corner. And we found much higher rates of mental health problems amongst these children than others. And I wrote a clumsy and overcomplicated policy brief in a naive attempt to think that something must be done. And I sent it to a colleague, and therein learnt my first lesson. The colleague I sent it to was a mentor, Professor Renfrew Christie, who was Dean of Research at the University of the Western Cape. He rang me that same day and asked me to meet him at the Belgian ambassador's cocktail party in Cape Town. What I didn't know was that Professor Christie had done his own doctorate at Oxford, like me, in the 1970s. His doctorate was on the electrification of South Africa, but it was actually a cover. He was a spy for the African National Congress. And in touring South Africa's electrification facilities, he had uncovered the nuclear weapons that the South African apartheid government was secretly building. He told the ANC, who destroyed them. And when Renfrew went back to South Africa, he spent the next 7 years on death row. In the cell next to him was a man called Zola Skweyiya, who went on to become the Minister of Social Development. And at that ambassador's cocktail party, Renfrew introduced me to Professor Skweyiya. And the next day, as I sat in his office in Parliament, I can remember having a teacup with gold rim around it and watching the tea move as my hands were shaking with fear. He told me something that made me realize something important about science. He said, "It is not enough." And I was confused. My sample size was enough, the power calculations were right, but that wasn't what he meant. What he meant was that the sample had been, these 1,000 children, had been in one province, and therefore amongst one tribal group. And if we were really going to make an impact in South Africa, we had to understand the political reality as well as the scientific reality. And so I went home and found myself running a national survey. And as we did this national survey with 6,000 children across all of South Africa, we started to see that things were not as they seemed. The AIDS epidemic was at its height across Africa. Hundreds and thousands of teenage girls were becoming infected every day, primarily through transactional sexual relationships, older men, sugar daddies, who were infecting young girls. And hundreds of millions of dollars was being spent on educational and behavioral change programs, teaching girls about the risks, persuading them that this was not the right way to be spending their lives, that they needed to invest in their futures. But when we looked at the data, something wasn't right. There wasn't any relationship between knowledge and transactional sex. There wasn't any relationship between behavior problems. There wasn't any relationship between the thinking and believing. Something just wasn't right. And one night, I sat up, working with my colleague, Professor Mark Orkin, who had been Mandela's first national statistician, and a good friend of Denise. Of the girls who I worked with as a social worker, and of the teen advisory group that we'd set up. From the morning when they woke up and got up at 4 a.m. to boil water for their family. Right questions to ask. We went back and we found that if an adolescent girl lived in a healthy family, if she didn't experience physical or emotional abuse at home, and she a week, she had a just under 1% chance of having transactional sex. If she lived in a family with an AIDS parent, she was abused and hungry, she had a 57% chance. Suddenly, those hundreds of millions of dollars didn't seem like they were going into the right place. And so we tried to understand the story. We developed structural equation models that tried to understand, what went on, what were the pathways to that. And I think at the time, actually, I was much too focused on the blue squares on the left. I was much too focused on HIV and wasn't thinking enough about what was going on in the middle. And we'll come back to that. It's taken me about 15 years. But I was giving this talk and talking about these findings in the African Union that year. And I learnt the next crucial lesson. I learnt to listen. A lady who you see here called Dr. Rachel Yates, who was then the chief of HIV at UNICEF, cornered me under the sweltering Addis sun. And she said to me, if poverty is driving these risks, then shouldn't social protection, government cash transfers, shouldn't they be protecting teenage girls? She said, can you find this in your data? It never occurred to me to look for this, and I had no idea. But it happened that as we were conducting this national longitudinal survey, the South African government was expanding its government child cash transfer, called the Child Support Grant, from the age of 10 as an upper limit to the age of 18. And this happened unevenly as any national program in Africa. But what it created was a natural experiment. And we were able to look at the impacts of this cash transfer. And what we found was very clear. For boys, it didn't do anything. For things like having sex when you're drunk or having multiple partners, it didn't have an impact. But for these two crucial factors, it did. An adolescent girl whose family got $20 a month of child support grant had a 50% reduced odds ratio of transactional sex and a 70% reduced odds ratio of age-disparate sex with a partner more than 5 years older than her. Something was happening. And we went on to do, with UNICEF and UNAIDS, a kind of, it was kind of like a road tour of African countries, sitting with the World Bank and talking with colleagues in governments around the region about this. But a gentleman and colleague at the World Bank who didn't agree with me at all about social protection challenged me. Why are you pushing something that isn't doing enough? It's not doing enough for other kinds of HIV risk. It's not doing enough for boys. And I started to try and think about where do we pull our questions from? Where do we pull our variables from? We'd been working from the basis of kind of child psychology. We'd brought in economics because UNICEF had asked us to. But it wasn't enough. And so we went and looked at child development. What do children need in order to grow up happy and healthy? And the answer from that was so clear that it wasn't just cash or money. It was also parenting. It was love and nurture. And when we put that into the models, it came out clear. For boys and for girls, the combination of cash plus care was what was the strongest way of reducing HIV risk. And these findings were ultimately included in the USA government's PEPFAR's DREAMS program, the $1 billion program of HIV prevention for adolescent girls. And we still work today with colleagues at the Global Fund to End AIDS, with UNAIDS, with UNICEF. And much of this is now led by my colleague, Dr. Ilona Tosca at University of Cape Town. She wrote this Global Fund technical brief, which came out a few weeks ago. But I think what it's helped me and what I still struggle to think through is how do you combine the credibility, the reality of the lived experiences of young people with what the data is telling us, but also with that moment of opportunity, that moment when you can influence policy, when there's enough people who want to believe what the data is telling them, when the opportunity is there. But that moment of opportunity is also still my greatest regret. After my PhD, I went to Columbia University for a visit, and there it was on an ESRC-funded studentship. They said I could go on a visit anywhere except Africa, so I went to New York. I'd never been to America. But I learned so much there, and one of the things I learned was that there was a clinic, a research clinic with adolescents who were living with HIV/AIDS, and their lives were really going wrong. They were struggling to take their antiretrovirals. They were dying and they were sick. And I knew that in South Africa, we had only just started to give antiretrovirals to children. And I realized that in 7 to 10 years' time, we were going to have that same challenge, but on a scale of tens and hundreds of times what they were seeing in the US. And I went back to South Africa, and I met with the Minister of Health to tell her that we needed to start that study now. We needed to start the research right now so that in 10 years' time, when it happened, we were ready with the answers of what to do to help them. But the minister that I met was Manto Shabalala, famous for her AIDS denialism. She shouted at me and sent me out of her office, and I didn't start the study until 7 years later. And by the time we started getting findings for that study, there were 1.7 million children living with HIV in South Africa and failing to take their antiretrovirals, dying. And it taught me something absolutely crucial. I mean, you know, we get good results. This is Sianazu, a researcher in our team, finding the impacts of cash plus care on antiretroviral adherence and HIV viral load. But it taught me that if you look into the future and you see a problem that is inevitably going to come, it is not an option to not do anything about it. And so we think about a next plague, something that went far beyond Africa, where it was far away from us, to all of us. And what led to some impacts that again changed how I saw social science. Back in 2012, when we'd realized that parenting was desperately important, we looked with colleagues in government at what was available. And the good news was there were evidence-based, highly effective parenting programs, group-based programs with 12 sessions usually, and they effectively prevented violence against children. The bad news was that these were commercialized. It was $100 million of business each year because those same things which prevent violence also reduce child behavior problems and improve family relationships. And so, working with colleagues at WHO and UNICEF and a team of academics across universities, we effectively developed evidence-based, free, open-source parenting programs. And these were tested by colleagues led by Jamie Luckman and Francis Gardner at Oxford, and Kathy Ward and Mark Tomlinson at Cape Town and Stellenbosch, in 15 randomized trials which showed that, you know, they really did work. And we delivered these with colleagues to maybe 300,000 families in about 20 countries. And we were feeling wrongly smug about what we'd done. And then a day hit in early March in 2020, when 1.9 billion children left school and went into lockdown with their families. And I got a phone call to say that my children's nursery, I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, were closing the next day for the foreseeable future. And I went to bed and woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning in a cold sweat, thinking two things. The first thing I thought was, what the hell am I going to do with a job and 2 small children? And the second thing I thought was that when I was a social worker, every holiday you saw a spike in child abuse. Every time there is a health emergency or an economic crisis, you see a spike in child abuse. And as 1.9 billion children went into their homes, some big but many tiny, with parents who were stressed, worried, exhausted, losing their jobs, I could see another crisis about to happen. And with colleagues like Dr. Asang Awa, who's sitting here, that morning at 5 a.m., we wrote to our friends and colleagues at UNICEF, at the World Health Organization, at the US CDC, at PEPFAR and DREAMS, at UNODC, and just said we have to do something. By midday that day, an interagency partnership had been developed. By that evening, we started work. We turned those evidence-based parenting programs into tip sheets, into radio programs, into TV programs, into public service announcements, any way we thought that we could reach people with evidence. Over the next 10 days, team in every UN agency and revised and changed, all the meanwhile volunteers. And over the next 18 months, with about 250 NGOs, these were delivered to just over 200 million people through 3 national government programs. This taught me 2 things. The first is that when there is a real crisis, many of the boundaries and structures that are set up to prevent people working together can fall away. And the second thing is that there is a global hunger and thirst for good social science. But as this happened, my colleague Jamie Lachman and I got given a talking to. And when that talking to comes from Cornelius Williams, who is the head of child protection at UNICEF, and the head of non-communicable disease at the World Health Organization, you listen. And what they said was, it's not enough to be delivering these light touch resources. We need people to be able to access the full evidence-based parenting programs. And we need them to be delivered not to hundreds of thousands, but to hundreds of millions of families. We need to be able to get them to them, even when there is a global crisis and they cannot see a person. And so we started working on a set of digital versions of these tools, an app, a text-based version, an online version. And we've been working through using the combined methodologies of public health and of what the digital technology world uses, A/B testing, rapid fire testing, to try and create something which can both reach massive scale, but also reach people. And I think this is where we're seeing these real losses in digital health technologies. They have a retention rate of around 2%, 2 to 5%. I use as an example the Nike personal training app, which is the most beautiful app I've ever seen in my life, and I have it on my phone. And one day I'm going to do it. But we have to move beyond that. We have to get from rates of 2% to rates of 65, 70% to have effectiveness. And we've discovered along the way, Asang has led much of this across 9 countries, that if you do it on its own, it doesn't work. But if people are part of a WhatsApp group with 50 other families and a human facilitator, you can still deliver at scale, but your retention rates are massively increased. We've also learned that there is huge government demand for this kind of work, and this is the Prime Minister of Tanzania announcing on national television that Parent App, our digital program, is going to be the new national program of Tanzania. Unfortunately, this was 5 months before the randomized control trial started, demonstrating perhaps that policy impact doesn't always happen on the timeline that you think and imagine it will. Our only hope right now is that the government will be slow enough that by the time they get to this, we will have the results. But as this was happening, something else was coming through. And this was another great challenge presented by COVID. The gentleman to the far left is called Pastor Billions. He is based in Zambia. And he started to notice that many, many more children were being orphaned. They were losing their parents and grandparents who were their primary caregivers to COVID. He served on a charity board with this lady, Captain Susan Hillis. He called her up one day and said, she was based at the CDC in the US, and said, we have to do something about the orphans of COVID. Susan called me at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was never very good at the time difference. And said, Lucy, do you remember HIV? When HIV happened, it took us 10 years to realize that an adult disease was affecting children. She said, we can't make that mistake again. And what we need, she said, is the world's best modelers to understand how many children have lost their parents to COVID. She said, I'm thinking about looking at Harvard. I said, I think I might be able to do better than Harvard. Because at my children's nursery, which was still closed, but we spent many hours standing by the playground in the freezing cold, one of the other fathers was Dr. Seth Flaxman, who was based at Imperial College and was one of the Imperial College COVID modelers. And so standing by the playground, we wore gloves that had fingerless gloves so that we could type while one of us watched the kids and the other one would send emails. I said to him, would you be willing to just spend a few days helping us out on something? 18 months later, he and colleagues like Etty Unwin and Joel Pascal and Twali Nkosi had recreated an entire new way of modeling fertility and mortality, combining WHO estimates as they came out with fertility estimates across the world, and had identified that we had 12.4 million children had lost a parent to COVID, a parent or primary caregiver. And here I learnt about combining advocacy and science, because as the modelers were doing their work, Susan was leading a whole campaign of work to understand what should we be doing to support these children based on what we'd learned during HIV, but also how were we going to advocate for that. And as these findings were released, we released them in a national report, a global report with the World Bank, with WHO, and other key leaders. And I saw what can happen when you combine advocacy, science, and a sense of what can be done. Within the last year, these findings and these recommendations have led to a Vatican decree, to publications in over 4,000 media articles, to several governments extending their social protection programs to COVID-affected children, to President Biden opening his global COVID summit with citing our findings. And recently, last month, the World Bank launched a rapid social response trust fund for children affected by COVID, for countries to apply for pump priming for larger funds. And I think if we can get that combination right, and I don't take credit for it, it was all led by my colleague, then we can see a road in for real impact. But COVID wasn't the last. And we come back to this future that quite frankly terrifies me. Part of me just wants to hide under the table and pretend it's not happening. But I think back to the mistake that I made with those children living with HIV, and I think that's not an option. And so we've been trying to build a hypothesis, those pathways that we developed with children orphaned by AIDS, where we're trying to think, are there shared pathways of risk and shared negative outcomes for children and adolescents from climate change, from new epidemics to come, and from conflict? You know, the data isn't as good as we'd like it to be. Yes, I mean, we are seeing some of these shared pathways, but, you know, from 1 or 2 studies, not from 20 or 30 studies. We should be being able at this point to look at hundreds of studies to determine what's going on. But if we are seeing these shared risk pathways, then there is the potential to think about shared solutions. And when we think about shared solutions, I come back to conversations that I had with colleagues in government across Africa. And this gentleman, Dr. Jürgen Pillay, was then the Deputy Director General of Health for South Africa. And he said to me, you know what you academics do? You come to us with your solution for your one thing, and you don't tell us what else it's going to do, and you don't tell us how much it's going to cost, and you don't tell us how much we're and come back with bang for buck. Jürgen never pulled punches. But it made me think differently about how we think about our research. You know, particularly in public health, we go in with a solution and we test out with our outcome. You know, our single narrow outcome, and we make our name on that outcome and we publish our papers on that outcome. That's our career. But actually, we might be needing to think this. What the UN Development Programme calls development accelerators, interventions and solutions which can have impacts across multiple outcomes, multiple sustainable development goals. And so I met with my colleague Doug Webb in Penny Lane Cafe, just opposite UNICEF or UNDP, which is where all the actual UN policy gets made. And he said to me, we love the idea of development accelerators, but we have no evidence for them at all. We don't know if they even exist. And so with a GCRF funding, we went out with colleagues across Africa to try to find out whether they did exist. Study our 1,000 children in the family, good parenting, and a school where they range of positive outcomes. This is a multi-level model controlling for everything you could think of. We saw a whole range of outcomes across multiple sustainable development goals. We've also seen this across other studies, across other countries. This is an example from the Violence Against Children surveys led by CDC, where we had 4 separate researchers looking across 4 countries to try and understand what combinations were most effective in reducing negative outcomes for adolescent girls. And we found across 4 countries, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya, Lesotho, that food security, positive gender norms, and good parenting were the strongest predictors. Cash plus care came out again. And as we looked at more than 30 studies, we saw the same patterns. We saw that cash or economic strengthening was coming out across many of them. But what could they be combined with? We see that cash combined with several different things can work. Cash plus adolescent-friendly health services, not being shouted at when you go to the clinic. Cash plus mental health support. Cash plus caregiver and parenting programs. Cash plus real comprehensive sexuality education. And if these are things that we're finding across development contexts, perhaps we have to think towards what Stefan Durkon talks about, dual disasters, the merging of humanitarian and development thinking. To think that can we build these things, should we be building these protective services into anticipatory action? Anticipatory action and pandemic preparedness don't normally talk about children, but should we be building those in order to prevent or block these risk pathways? I did say I wouldn't be hubristic, I'm sorry. It probably is at this point. But if we do that, then we have to work out not just what to deliver, but how to deliver. How can we deliver it to hundreds of millions, not hundreds of thousands? And how can we deliver it when we are all in lockdown again? And so we've spent the last year talking and listening to colleagues. We've talked to UN agencies back in Penny Lane Cafe. We've talked to national governments, mainly across Africa, but also to colleagues in Ukraine and Pakistan. We've talked to donor agencies, a crucial part of the nexus, and often with great thinkers within them. We've talked to children and adolescents and young people, and we've talked to NGOs and civil society. And what we hear is this: they know it's coming. They know these challenges are coming, but they are dealing with so many things right now, they don't necessarily have the headspace to think through how are we going to deal with this. And they don't have the evidence to know how they're going to build into actions of preparedness, something which is going to new ways to try and address this. With the data, we're working back those computer scientists who modeled the COVID orphans. We're thinking about how you can use AI methods to overlay social science with climate data, with mortality data from and pandemic data from the World Health Organization. And can we use this to try and understand not just the extent of the problem, not just how many children and where are they, but what are the impacts and what might be solutions? And at the same time as getting this data and this understanding, we have to be building those solutions. We're thinking about how we can build digital ecosystems, again, learning from technology. Can we build systems by which we can deliver hundreds of millions in crisis situations? I don't know. I don't know whether this is going to work. But we don't have time to do the modeling first and then develop the systems and then work out how to deliver them. And so we've got a big task on our hands in this next decade. There is no way that we will do it alone. We'll do it if social scientists and medical scientists and data scientists work together. And I think we have to do it because these people, these children, their families, they deserve the absolute best social science. Thank you to our funders, and thank you.
The great goddess data never lies. Lucie, thank you very much. Really impressive. And we think hard about cash transfers. Questions? We've got a good 15, 20 minutes before we break. I can kick things off. Anne?
I don't have a question, but who befriended Mantu Shabalala when she was a humble doctor in Tanzania in the 1970s, and who led
Just hold a second, there's a microphone coming.
and led a campaign for death cancer.
Just stop a second, wait for a second, because I think what you're saying is very important. Everyone can hear it. Is that working?
Anyway,
Oh,
I just want to
too
say
bad.
incredibly well done, and I'd love to chat afterwards. But I don't have a
There you are.
question.
Anne, can you just say it again?
Oh dear, here we go. I just wanted to repeat that I think this was a fantastic presentation, and the work that you and your colleagues have done is so impressive, and thank you very much for it. And I speak as someone who's South African born, who knew Mantu Shabalala when she was a humble doctor in Tanzania in the 1970s, who went on to lead the Jubilee 2000 debt relief campaign, and then subsequently worked with DFID on a campaign which ended up quite tragically, which was the maternal mortality, the attempt to reduce maternal mortality across several countries in Africa, which was cut in half. Its budget was cut in half as we were beginning to make progress on that by DFID. So I don't really have anything to question you about, but I really would like to talk to you afterwards. It's very exciting work. Thank you.
And I would love to ask your advice on what I should have done in that meeting with Manto. You know, I was 27 and terrified, and I regret it so much, you know.
Yeah, you just say who you are. There's a few questions around. We'll take two or three, and then people.
Thank you. And so sorry, I'm Susan Mickey. I'm Professor of Health Psychology at UCL.
I can't quite hear you.
Ah. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Again, thank you, great presentation. I'm Susan Mickey and I'm Professor of Health Psychology at University College London. Is it possible to put up the slide just before this one, or the one that says, I don't want your theory? which I think... I just wanted to ask you what you thought about this quote, because so often we come across this. My view is that theory explains why what you're doing has the outcome that it has, and unless you have that explanation of those pathways at many different levels, then you don't understand, and then you can't accumulate evidence, and then you can't improve things. So I just be really interested, and you didn't actually talk about theory in terms of any particular theories. So I'm just interested to know the extent to which you did use theory in informing your work or in summarising your results, and also how you tend to deal with people who say this kind of thing.
Well done, answer. Very good questions. Questioner here.
Thank you. David James, Cardiff University. Thanks very much for that excellent talk. We saw plenty of evidence in the pandemic in the UK, for example, of people taking the opportunity to engage in various corrupt and semi-corrupt exploitation of the situation. It's really good to hear kind of the alternative view, which you mentioned, which is that crises give an opportunity for certain kind of barriers to fall away. And I just wondered whether you had any further thoughts about that for social scientists seeking to have impact when they've got very good evidence to hand with the political systems in which we operate. Thank you.
Oh, I can't remember more than two. Can I?
More than two. Okay. They're quite challenging questions. But we go with another round coming up. Take them in pairs.
The question about theory is absolutely crucial, and I think the risk is that when you're not explicit about your theory is that it's implicit, and then you don't question the biases that come with it. But I think the question is not whether theory is important. Of course it is, it's crucial. It underlies everything we do. It's how we market it. You know, I think about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is this combination. It's what sugar, brown stuff, water, fizzy stuff. There's a whole science about what goes into Coca-Cola. But when you see those billboards, you know, and I think of it because, you know, you drive through Africa and you see these giant billboards, and what those billboards show is a gorgeous woman drinking Coca-Cola in the sunshine. And it tells me that it is not about us, it's about them. It's about the policymaker and what they want, what they need, what's in the top of their mind as their challenge. And if you can hit what's in the top of their mind, then you can have impact. And it's not always, and I don't get it right a lot of the time, but my colleagues will often tell me now when I get it wrong. But I think that was what he was saying. It was at a World Bank meeting in Johannesburg. It was freezing cold. It was July. And I'd just given this presentation. And he said to me, like, I just want to know what to do. And I thought about the challenges that he was facing, you know, the budget decisions that he was having to make, the worry. He genuinely wanted to know what was best to do for the children in his country. And I thought that's an opportunity. But it then is our responsibility to get it right. And we can't do that without the right theory. So I don't know. But I do think back to Coca-Cola. We're not always as good at that as Coca-Cola. But then you had this great question about what's the opportunity for some pretty robust institutional barriers to come down. Honestly, I don't know, because within 3 weeks of us starting this initiative, each of the agencies had set up COVID approval committees. And things which happened 3 weeks later took 6 months to come out, because, you know, there was a structure, there was a system, there was a structure for interagency collaboration. We just got in before it started. And I don't know what will happen. I don't know what will happen in the future. But we were able to turn that interagency collaboration into a formal collaboration between WHO, UNICEF, and a group of UN agencies with us as academics. And so maybe there is potential for what can start off as a crisis response to become something that's a feasible, like a feasible collaboration that can break down some of the necessities that agencies and universities feel to promote themselves. It seems to work when you don't have to promote yourself, but that's a big challenge.
Question here. Sorry, we'll come to you next. Yeah.
Thank you again. I love your insight that one has to think ahead, and it's a difficult thing to do. And I also love your insight that we need science plus politics plus advocacy. But there seems to me a fourth factor, which you touched on in one example, and that is what's going on beneath. That is community. Because if all those people work together, but the community is still denying climate change, the next pandemic and the need for lockdown, how can you get people to change their habits as well as the institutions change, which you've just been talking about? And you mentioned WhatsApp, which was one example, and I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Pass the mic to the front.
Yeah, mine kind of links with that, so hopefully that will help you in thinking of the answer. So I'm John Pullinger, and I've just stepped down after 7 years of something called the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And like you, we did a lot of work on the supply side. But my question to you is, how do we stimulate the demand side? Why aren't there more governments, more mayors, more optimists like the young Will Hutton that see the evidence-based solution to the state that we're currently in? Because it baffles me why there is not much more dramatic demand for all the things you've talked about, particularly given what we've just been through with COVID. Do you have an answer to that $64 million question?
Yeah, these are big questions. Working with those who deny, honestly, I don't know. I mean, if anyone here has, I'd love to understand more about that. I think. Perhaps parenting programs are a good example, actually. Parenting programs, you never go in saying that this is about preventing you abusing your child. That would be a marketing disaster in every possible way. What you do is you go in and you say this. Well, actually, does anyone here have children? Is anyone here exhausted sometimes by their children? Does anyone find parenting sometimes a challenge? And when we go into communities and we ask, do you sometimes feel exasperated by your teenager? We get 100% positive response rate. And when we were doing the COVID parenting work, we used to call up government ministers. We had a team of 40 people making phone calls, but for government ministers, I would sometimes do them. And I would start the spiel, the COVID is, child abuse and risk of this and need for parents. And the minister would say, stop. I'm trapped in my office in the basement and my 3 kids are upstairs and they are driving me crazy and I've never had to look after them before. These were often male ministers. And they said, can you just send me the tips, please? And then we'll talk about the country. And it made me think that we have to go in with what people want. We have to go in with their desires, not our desires for them. Is that an answer to COVID denialism? I don't know. It's just a tiny, tiny part of thinking about how do we address something difficult and challenging and hard for people. Your question about demand of governments, and not just governments, donors, for data. And I have to say, the work we've used your data, and it's amazing what you've done, and it's also easy to use and exciting and dynamic. I think we work with the willing. You know, we work with those in every agency and every government who cares. We've been doing a set of work on adolescent pregnancy with the South African government, and bringing data together with young mothers and policymakers. And we discover that in every department of each part of the national government, there are women who are teenage mothers themselves, and they are the ones who fight for this. And how can we find those people who feel that these challenges are to come, are risking them and their children? How can they want to fight for this? We may have to think about the psychology, and also the psychology of fear, because that's what I've been seeing as we've talked to colleagues across all these agencies. We keep hearing people say, we know we have to do something about it, but we don't have the bandwidth right now. That's the phrase I hear most often. And I don't think it's that. These people are huge intellects. They're dealing with so many things. It's that we're scared. We're scared of it. And when we're scared, we deal with the other things that we can deal with more.
Challenging answers. Yes, a couple of... So I'm just musing over these replies.
Thank you, Lucy. That was really inspiring. I'm Alison Park from the ESRC. You mentioned towards the end.
Alison, could you put the mic close to your mouth?
Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Alison Park, ESRC. You mentioned towards the end the sort of potential of new forms of data. So some of the non-survey data that you've been using. It'd be great just to hear a little bit more about that, and whether you see that as ultimately replacing some of the surveys that you've been carrying out, or whether you just see it as being an incredibly useful way of augmenting them. I mean, I come from a survey background, and I find it hard to imagine how you'd be able to use only non-survey forms of data, but it would just be really fantastic to hear your thoughts on how these new forms of data might really allow you to do more at scale. Thank you.
Just hand it back to you.
Hi, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Lucy. I'm Alison Brown from Cardiff University, another Alison, also from Cardiff. And I wanted to ask you how you deal with the gaps. You said that political capital is everything, but also you are looking at conflict when you know there's areas where you can't collect data. And on your previous slide, the one you just showed, one of the areas I'm interested in is cities, but particularly local governments. How do you deal with that political gap? Because international agencies don't deal with local governments, but they're often at the forefront of that delivery process. Thank you.
You're not giving the easy questions, folks. So, Alison, I don't think that kind of data can replace surveys in any way, at all. What I think that we need to do, if it's possible, and I don't know yet whether it is to become better at linking up these different sources to answer the questions that we need. And I think, the example of this, we're trying to do this in Nigeria at the moment. So we've got the multiple indicator cluster survey. It's this amazing survey set up by UNICEF. It's got loads of really great questions about health, about social and economic outcomes for children. But it doesn't tell us which of those children are in a flood-affected area. And it doesn't tell us which of those children are in a Boko Haram-affected area. And it doesn't tell us which of those children are in an area which COVID or Ebola has struck worst in. And so, but it does have new questions, which were actually introduced by my colleague Rachel Yates 10 years ago at UNICEF, about social protection. So now we can look at the mixed survey and we can say, do teenage girls, a 12-year-old girl, does she do better in her education, in her health, in her likelihood of child marriage when her family gets social protection? And if we can overlay that with climate data and with epidemic data and with conflict data, we can then say, does a 12-year-old girl in a Boko Haram affected area that has had a major flood in the last 2 years, does she do better with social protection? And is it good enough, or do we need to add something else to that? I don't know if it's possible, and the data scientists are saying that the data is so different that we're going to have to create, and this is where they see opportunity of new AI-focused techniques, which essentially all the AI is doing is allowing us to take data that is measured in different ways on different kind of geocodes and be able to look through it. If we can look through those kinds of data to the survey data, we can do more with it, I think. Now, your question about local government and the power of local government, which can never be underestimated, both here, but also, you go to somewhere in rural Malawi and it's the street committee that ultimately makes the decisions. I think, first of all, I don't know. But I think that when you try to think about all of the different groups and people that you have to influence to make a change, it becomes quite overwhelming. And you're almost tempted to think, well, either I won't do it at all, or I'll write the paper and hope that they read it. I've discovered that no policymaker has ever read any of my papers, ever, or ever will, I think. So that hasn't worked for me. Or you think, I'll focus on the one I can, like the one I know, the person I know, the agency I know. And I think that you're right in saying that's not enough. And so maybe, we study systems as social scientists. We study systems and how systems work and how ideas and policies trickle down. Can we use those systems and our understanding of them to work with others to trickle down evidence? Sometimes we've succeeded, sometimes we haven't in that, I think. Sorry, it's a really hard one.
Huge challenge.
Yeah.
But I can tell you what has started to work. We've started to be contacted by youth advocates. For example, there's a group in Lesotho of youth advocates who recently used some of our findings to advocate for what their country would request from the Global Fund for their HIV programming. In Sudan, there's groups, in Sudan this has been really challenged recently, but groups of teenage advocates have been using our data to argue with the government for greater spending on electrification and social protection. Maybe that's a possibility, a possible way in.
Social influences, really.
Yeah, I don't think in the public way. Like they are advocates.
Yeah.
They're rallying and they're sort of they're not going to the streets. They're going to political meetings and arguing with the power that their voice and legitimacy brings.
More than, yeah.
Thank you very much, Lucie, for the fabulous presentation and also excellent conversation going on. So when I was listening to that and also listening to the discussion, oh, by the way, I'm Muthu Disula, a professor from Birkbeck, University of London. When I'm thinking that, like sometimes a major challenge we face is that we introduce interventions and we offer funding to resolve a social challenge, but after the funding period, the initiative will die, there's no continuation and nowhere of scaling it up. But then I have also studied some of the cases where they have introduced a different model, like for instance, to mitigate illegal wildlife trade. Rather than directly offering funding, they have scaled up startups who have produced technologies that would resolve the illegal wildlife trade. So they develop products and services. So, and then the more business value these firms generate, more social value you generate. So I just wanted to understand whether you could think of, or whether you have seen these kinds of models where whatever the intervention would be continued and scaled up in that scenario. So then we don't have to do everything. We just need to offer some support. So then automatically it will be resolved and continued. The solution will be continued. Thank you.
There's a point over here. We're going to get to a wind-up moment imminent.
Lucy, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Caridwen Roberts. I just wondered if I could pick up this interesting point you've just made about youth advocates. I totally take your point that politicians don't read your papers, but how did the youth advocates know about it? And actually that is a really key issue. In the work I've done in the past, what you wanted to do was to get to people who needed to have that information so they could argue for it themselves and be a sort of a political force in their own right. How did you work that?
Caridwen taught me when I was a trainee social worker, so it's lovely to see you. I hope I learned something. Those youth advocates and others like the Brave movement, which is a movement of survivors of child sexual violence in Africa, it was through presentations. It was through going out there and giving talks. You know, not me, colleagues of mine. Through being in the meetings, not the academic spaces by any means. I was terrified giving this talk. I never talk to academics, and it was through those environments that they find. You know, they want to go with something that they can lay down and say, this is why you have to do this. Of course, it only works if what we're finding is what they want and need. But I think a good example is this the Brave movement, where they actually came to us and said, we've got this whole movement of survivors of child sexual violence. It's actually a global movement. And they said, we want to prevent these things happening to our children. And we want to campaign. They started off with something to extend the statute of limitations for prosecution of child sexual abuse. And they said, but we want evidence. We want to know what it is that will protect our children. And then we will put the force and might of our advocacy and lobbying behind that. I think we have to get better at finding them. I think we've done it more happenstance. So your question was about private, like working with the private sector and what's the possibilities. And I would love to hear more about these successes, because I think we don't know. You know, if we think about the work we've done on parenting programs, the private sector has not been a good way to reach the most vulnerable. It has had impact, sure. It's probably reached hundreds of thousands of families through these commercialized companies. You know, just one of them has an annual turnover of over $200 million a year. It's big business. But it's reaching the families who can afford, you know, $1,000 for a parenting program, or the countries where there's a rich enough province or state that can afford to buy it for the state. And so that's, to me, the challenge. How do we work with the private sector in a way that we can reach the people who are never going to be lucrative for them? We've started to work with Vodacom and Safaricom on these parenting programs, and they see opportunity because they see that people will have a kind of sense of warmth and engagement with their phone and you know, a kind of product recognition. But I don't know if that's going to work. Like, I don't know whether that will be enough to really engage them, or whether it will have the results that we sort of both hope. I'd love to hear more about what's been successful in wildlife, because it's a really interesting parallel.
Okay, look, we're really at the end, but there might be somebody who's really passionate, they really want to ask you the killer question.
I want to ask the question, but it's not a killer.
You're allowed, but that's the last question. The last question.
Denise Leavesley. Thank you very much, Lucy. Absolutely fantastic. I'd like to ask you a personal question, which is, I mean, you talk about so many different projects and so many different topics. How do you decide to do something new when you've got the pressure of sustaining all the million of things that have started? So how are you making the decisions in terms of your career?
Badly. My colleague Asang and I were talking about this today. Asang's just been offered national television coverage in Nigeria and is trying to work out how to fit that in. Not strategically enough. I see a problem and I think we have to do something. And it seems so obvious and so necessary. And then sometimes when something is obvious and necessary, people give you money to do it. And then you build like a whole thing. And then you're right, you have to both sustain that thing, and then the next challenge sneaks up on you and is necessary and urgent. I had dinner in New York a few weeks ago when I was talking to these policymakers with Professor Larry Aber, who some of you might know. He's like a complete genius in social psychology. He's at NYU, and he's in the later part of his career, and he said to me, I regret all of the sleep I lost over the last 40 years. He said, I truly regret it. And I said, okay, Larry, what would you have not done to have gotten that sleep? And he looked at me, he said, nothing. There's nothing I wouldn't have done. I don't know.
That's a fine answer. We think there's nothing you wouldn't do, actually. Okay, look, let's give a round of applause to Lucie.